The blazing sun beat down mercilessly as Dorothy Mills stood alone in the vast, unforgiving desert, her throat parched and her hope dwindling with each passing minute. The cattle drive had continued without her, leaving nothing but dust clouds on the horizon and the cruel reality that she had been abandoned to the ruthless elements of the West Texas wilderness. The year was 1878, and Dorothy had never imagined her life would end this way. At 22, she had been determined to prove herself capable of handling the journey from San Antonio to the cattle markets farther west. Being the only woman on the drive had already made her position precarious, but she'd worked twice as hard as any man to earn her place. Now, as the blistering heat seared her skin and the last drops of her canteen had long since disappeared, she wondered if her ambition would be her undoing. Dorothy sank to her knees in the scorched earth, her once pristine blue dress now stained with dust and sweat. Her father's cattle ranch had been everything to her, especially after his passing 3 months ago. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and this drive was her last hope to save what remained of her family legacy. She'd convinced the trail boss to let her join, assuring him she could handle the work. Everything had gone well until yesterday when her horse threw her during a thunderstorm. By the time she'd regained consciousness, the herd had moved on. She tried to follow their tracks, but the rain had washed away most signs, and in her disorientation, she'd chosen the wrong direction. The sun was directly overhead now, relentlessly punishing. Dorothy pulled her hat lower over her face and tried to find shelter beneath a scraggly mesquite tree. Its sparse branches offered little protection, but it was better than nothing. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's words, "When in trouble, stay put. Moving without direction in this desert is a death sentence." She wondered if trail boss Jenkins had even noticed her absence yet. He had made it clear from the beginning that he considered her presence a nuisance, only tolerating her because her father had been respected in the cattle community. Perhaps he was glad to be rid of her. As consciousness began to slip away, Dorothy thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Probably just another hallucination from the heat, she reasoned. Her mind had been playing tricks on her for hours. The sound grew louder. Dorothy forced her eyes open, squinting against the sun's glare. A silhouette appeared on the horizon, a lone rider pushing his horse hard across the desert floor. She struggled to her feet, swaying unsteadily. "Hello," she tried to call, but her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. She waved her arms frantically, praying the rider would spot her. The figure changed direction slightly, heading directly toward her. Relief flooded through her as she realized she'd been seen. As the rider drew closer, Dorothy could make out his features. He wasn't one of the drovers from their outfit. This man was taller, with broad shoulders and a determined set to his jaw. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, kicked up dust as it galloped across the barren landscape. The stranger pulled his horse to a halt a few feet away from her. Dust swirled around them as he dismounted in one fluid motion. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, assessed her condition quickly. "Miss Mills?" he asked, his voice deep and concerned. Dorothy nodded weakly, surprised he knew her name. "Luke Yancy," he introduced himself, already reaching for a canteen strapped to his saddle. "I rode with your father a few years back." Luke uncorked the canteen and handed it to her. "Small sips," he cautioned as she reached for it with trembling hands. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The water tasted sweeter than anything Dorothy had ever experienced. She wanted to gulp it down but heeded his warning, taking small, measured sips. "Jenkins sent you?" she asked hopefully after moistening her parched lips. Luke's expression hardened. "No, madam. I was trailing the herd, planning to join up in Marfa." saw the tracks split off. One rider searching briefly, then returning to the main group. Didn't sit right with me. Dorothy felt a surge of anger. They looked for me, then gave up. Appears so, Luke said, his tone neutral but his eyes revealing his disgust at their actions. Jenkins has a schedule to keep and a reputation for valuing cattle more than people. Luke began unpacking supplies from his saddlebags. He unfolded a canvas sheet and rigged it between his horse and the mesquite tree, creating a small patch of shade. Next came a second canteen and some jerky. "Eat slowly," he advised, handing her the dried meat. "Your stomach will need time to adjust." Dorothy took the jerky gratefully. As the water and food began to revive her, she studied her rescuer more carefully. Luke Yancy was older than her, perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years on the trail. His movements were efficient and purposeful as he tended to his horse, ensuring the animal had water as well. "Why did you come back for me?" Dorothy asked. "You don't even know me." Luke paused, adjusting his hat. "I knew your father, Jack Mills, was a good man, taught me a lot about cattle and even more about doing right by people." He met her gaze. "Besides, no one deserves to die out here alone." Dorothy felt tears threatening. She blinked them back, determined not to appear weak. "Thank you, I wasn't ready to die today." A hint of a smile touched Luke's lips. "No one ever is, Miss Mills." "Dorothy," she corrected him. "After saving my life, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." Luke nodded. "Dorothy." The way he said it carefully, as if testing how it felt on his tongue, sent an unexpected shiver through her despite the heat. As the worst of her dehydration eased, Dorothy began to think more clearly. "The drive is headed to Marfa." "Yes," Luke confirmed, "but you're in no condition to catch up with them today. We'll rest here until the worst heat passes, then make for the nearest water. There's a small creek about 5 miles east." "I can't delay you," Dorothy protested. "My father's cattle will reach the market with or without you," Luke finished firmly, "and they'll fetch the same price. Your health comes first." Dorothy wanted to argue but knew he was right. She was in no condition to travel far, and pushing too hard might result in both of them being stranded. As the afternoon wore on, Luke shared more of his water and food. He spoke little but kept a watchful eye on her recovery. Dorothy learned he had been working ranches across Texas since he was 16, drifting from job to job, but building a solid reputation as a capable cowhand. "I met your father during a particularly bad drought in '71, Luke explained as they sat in the shade. "He hired me when most ranchers were letting men go. Said he valued experience over saving a few dollars." Dorothy smiled at the memory. "That sounds like Pa. He always said the right men were worth their weight in gold during hard times." "He was right about that." Luke glanced at the horizon, judging the time. "The sun will be setting in a few hours. We should start making our way to that creek. Can you ride?" Dorothy nodded, though uncertainty must have shown on her face. "You'll ride with me," Luke decided, not waiting for further discussion. "My horse is strong enough for both of us, and it's safer than risking you falling again." He dismantled their makeshift shelter and repacked his saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, they were ready to leave. Luke mounted first, then reached down to help Dorothy up behind him. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his hand. His grip was firm and reassuring as he pulled her up. Dorothy settled behind him, suddenly aware of their proximity. Propriety dictated she should maintain some distance, but practicality won out. She would need to hold on to him to stay mounted through the uneven terrain. "You'll need to hold on," Luke said, echoing her thoughts. "The ground's rough ahead." Dorothy tentatively placed her hands on his waist. As they began to move, the horse's gait forced her to grip tighter, bringing her closer to Luke's back. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his cotton shirt, smell the scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional call of a desert bird. The sun began its descent, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Despite her ordeal, Dorothy couldn't help but appreciate the stark beauty of the desert at this hour. "It's beautiful in its own way, isn't it?" she remarked, breaking the silence. Luke glanced back at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Most folks only see the danger." "Oh, I see that too," Dorothy assured him. "But there's something honest about the desert. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "That's a rare quality in places and in people." As they continued eastward, Dorothy noticed Luke occasionally scanning the horizon with a vigilance that seemed more than casual observation. "Are you looking for something?" she asked. "Just being cautious," he replied. "Apache bands still move through these parts occasionally. They generally leave travelers alone these days, but it pays to stay alert." Dorothy felt a flutter of unease. Her father had told stories of the conflicts between settlers and the Apache people years ago. Though relations had improved since most tribes had been moved to reservations, isolated incidents still occurred. "Have you had trouble with them before?" she asked. "Not trouble exactly," Luke said. "I've traded with them a few times. If you treat them with respect, they usually return the favor. But these are hard times for everyone, and desperation can make anyone dangerous." They fell silent again, both lost in their own thoughts as they traversed the rugged landscape. The temperature began to drop as the sun sank lower, bringing welcome relief from the day's heat. Just as twilight was settling in, they reached the creek Luke had mentioned. It wasn't much, just a narrow ribbon of water flowing between rocky banks, but to Dorothy, it looked like paradise. Luke helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist. Her legs wobbled as they touched the ground, stiff from the ride and weak from her ordeal. Luke kept a supportive hand on her arm until she found her balance. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. In the fading light, his features seemed softer, his eyes reflecting the first emerging stars. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll get a fire going. Nights get cold out here." Dorothy watched as he efficiently gathered dried brush and arranged it for a small fire. His movements were economical, speaking of years spent in the wilderness. Within minutes, he had a cheerful blaze going, the flames casting dancing shadows across the creek bank. Luke unsaddled his horse and led the animal to drink, then hobbled it nearby where it could graze on the sparse vegetation. From his saddlebags, he produced more jerky, some hardtack, and a small pouch of coffee. "It's not much of a supper," he apologized as he set about preparing the coffee in a small tin pot. "It's a feast to me," Dorothy assured him. She settled beside the fire, grateful for its warmth as the temperature continued to drop. "This morning I thought I might never eat again." Luke's expression grew serious. It was a close thing, another day out there alone. He let the sentence hang unfinished. "Why would they leave me?" Dorothy asked, the question that had been burning inside her all day finally emerging. "I paid my share. I worked as hard as any of them." Luke sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. "Some men don't take kindly to women stepping outside what they see as their proper place. Jenkins is old school that way. Probably figured you'd slowed them down enough as it was." "I never slowed them down," Dorothy said indignantly. "I was up before dawn every day, worked until after dark. Never complained once." "I believe you," Luke said simply. "But men like Jenkins don't see what they don't want to see." The coffee began to boil, and Luke carefully poured it into 2 tin cups. He handed one to Dorothy, who accepted it gratefully. The bitter liquid warmed her from the inside, bringing new life to her tired body. "What will you do now?" Luke asked. "The drive will reach Marfa in about 4 days. We could catch up if we push hard, but—" Dorothy considered her options. The cattle drive represented her last hope of saving her father's ranch. The bank note was due at the end of the month, and without the proceeds from selling the cattle, she'd lose everything. "I need to be there when they sell," she said firmly. "Those are my father's cattle, my cattle now. Jenkins may have abandoned me, but he can't sell what isn't his." Luke studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "That's going to be a problem. Jenkins has the drive papers. Your signature might be on them, but he's the trail boss." "My father always kept duplicates," Dorothy said, a small smile forming. "I have signed copies of everything in my saddlebag." Her smile faltered. "Which is with my horse, wherever that is now." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "Your horse likely followed the herd. Trail horses usually do." "We'll find it when we catch up." "If we catch up," Dorothy corrected. "You said yourself it would be difficult." "Difficult, not impossible," Luke replied with quiet confidence. "I know these trails better than Jenkins does. There are shortcuts he won't take because they're riskier for a large herd. For just the two of us, we can make better time." Hope flared in Dorothy's chest. "You do that for me. Help me catch them." Luke held her gaze steadily. "I told you I respected your father. And I don't much care for men who leave people to die in the desert." Dorothy felt a rush of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed her. "I can't offer much payment, not until the cattle sell, at least." Luke shook his head. "I'm not doing it for money." "Then why?" Dorothy pressed, needing to understand this man who had risked his own safety for a stranger. Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've been alone out here too long. Sometimes a man needs to be reminded that there are still good reasons to help others." The simple honesty of his words touched Dorothy deeply. In a world where everyone seemed to have an angle or an ulterior motive, Luke Yancy's straightforward decency was refreshing. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons," she said softly. They finished their meager meal in companionable silence. The night had fully descended now, the desert sky ablaze with stars. Dorothy couldn't remember ever seeing them so bright or so numerous. "We should get some rest," Luke suggested eventually. "Dawn comes early, and we'll need to be on the move if we want to make good time tomorrow." He unrolled his bedroll and, to Dorothy's surprise, offered it to her. "I'll keep watch for a while," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "You need rest too," Dorothy protested. "I'm used to short nights," Luke assured her. "Been on cattle drives where we slept in shifts for weeks. Take the bedroll. The ground gets cold." Too tired to argue further, Dorothy accepted his generosity. The bedroll smelled of leather, horse, and something uniquely Luke, not unpleasant, but distinctly masculine. As she settled in, exhaustion overtook her quickly. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Luke's profile against the starlit sky, his posture alert yet relaxed, a silent guardian in the vast desert night. Dorothy woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of morning. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale blush against the receding darkness. Luke was already up, tending to a fresh fire and checking his horse. He looked as if he'd been awake for hours, showing no signs of fatigue despite his night watch. "Morning," he greeted her, voice low and respectful of the dawn quiet. "Coffee's almost ready." Dorothy sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair in a futile attempt to restore some order to it. She was painfully aware of how disheveled she must look after her ordeal in the desert and a night sleeping on the ground. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup he offered. "Did you sleep at all?" Enough, Luke replied, which Dorothy suspected meant very little. We should reach Thompson Station by midday if we make good time, can resupply there. Dorothy sipped her coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. I don't have money for supplies, she admitted. Everything I had was in my saddlebags. I've got enough, Luke assured her. We'll settle accounts after we catch up with the herd and get your cattle sold. They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and the last of the hardtack, then packed up their small camp. Luke saddled his horse while Dorothy filled their canteens from the creek. Within 30 minutes of waking, they were mounted and heading northeast. The morning was pleasantly cool, the harsh desert heat not yet fully awakened. Dorothy sat behind Luke again, her arms around his waist as they rode. She'd grown more comfortable with the arrangement, no longer feeling quite so self-conscious about the proximity. Out here in the wilderness, conventional propriety seemed less important than practicality and survival. Tell me about your ranch, Luke said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Dorothy brightened at the mention of her home. The Double M isn't the biggest spread, but my father built it from nothing. We run about 500 head of cattle, mixed Longhorn and Durham stock. Pa was experimenting with crossbreeding to get hardier animals with better meat. Pride colored her voice as she continued. We've got good water rights and decent grazing land. Or we did, until the drought hit last year. That's what forced the cattle drive, Luke asked. Dorothy nodded, then realized he couldn't see the gesture. Yes, we had to sell off more than we wanted just to keep the rest fed. This drive was supposed to get us back on our feet. She paused. I don't know what I'll do if we lose the ranch. It's all I have left of him. Luke was quiet for a moment. Your father was fortunate to have a daughter who cares so much about his legacy. Most men around San Antonio don't see it that way, Dorothy said with a hint of bitterness. They think a woman has no business running a cattle ranch. The bank's been pushing me to sell ever since Pa died, claiming they're doing me a favor by relieving me of such a burden. And is it a burden? Luke asked. Dorothy considered the question seriously. It's hard work, she acknowledged. Endless hours, constant worry about weather and water and 1,000 other things that could go wrong. But it's also freedom. The satisfaction of building something with your own hands, watching your herd thrive because of decisions you made. She smiled, though he couldn't see it. No, it's not a burden, it's a privilege, Luke nodded. That's how my father felt about our place in East Texas. Small farm, barely enough to feed us, but he loved every acre of it. You didn't stay to run it. Dorothy asked, realizing this was the first personal detail Luke had shared about himself. Wasn't mine to run, Luke said, a hint of old pain in his voice. Farm went to my older brother when Pa died. I was 16, already working cattle drives by then. William offered to let me stay on as a hand, but he trailed off. But you wanted something of your own, Dorothy finished for him. Something like that, Luke agreed. Been working other men's land ever since, saving what I can. One day I'll have my own spread. The conversation flowed more easily after that. As they rode through the rugged landscape, they exchanged stories of their lives. Dorothy learned that Luke had worked ranches across Texas and as far north as Wyoming Territory. He'd driven cattle on the Kishome Trail, fought off rustlers, endured blizzards and droughts. For his part, Luke seemed genuinely interested in Dorothy's experiences running the Double M, asking questions about her breeding programs and grazing rotation strategies. By midday, as Luke had predicted, they reached Thompson Station, little more than a trading post, a livery stable, and a small saloon that served basic meals. As they approached, Dorothy became acutely aware of her appearance. Her dress was filthy, her hair a tangled mess, and she knew she must look like she'd been dragged behind a horse for miles. Luke seemed to sense her discomfort. "There's a washroom behind the trading post," he told her quietly. "The owner's wife, Mrs. Thompson, is a kind woman. She might have some clean clothes she could spare." Dorothy felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, I must look a fright." A hint of a smile touched Luke's lips. "You look like someone who survived the desert. That's nothing to be ashamed of." They dismounted in front of the trading post. A few curious glances came their way from the handful of men loitering on the porch of the saloon across the way. Dorothy kept her head high, ignoring their stares. Inside the trading post, a portly man with a magnificent mustache greeted them. "Yancy. Didn't expect to see you coming from that direction. Thought you'd be with the Mills Drive heading to Marfa." "Change of plans, Thompson," Luke replied easily. "This is Miss Dorothy Mills. We had a bit of trouble on the trail." Thompson's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Mills, Jack's daughter?" Dorothy nodded. "Yes, sir, you knew my father." "Sure did. Traded with him many a time." Thompson's expression softened. "Terrible sorry to hear of his passing, miss. He was a good man." "Thank you," Dorothy said, touched by the genuine sentiment in the man's voice. Luke explained their situation briefly, omitting the details of Jenkins abandoning Dorothy. Instead, he simply said they'd been separated from the drive and needed to catch up. "Martha," Thompson called toward the back of the store, "come out here. We've got company needs some help." A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She was plump and pleasant-faced, with kind eyes that assessed Dorothy's condition in one comprehensive glance. "Land's sakes, child, you look like you've been through the ringer," she said, her tone sympathetic rather than judgmental. "Come on back with me. We'll get you fixed up." Dorothy glanced at Luke, who nodded encouragingly. "Go on. I'll see to supplies and the horse." Martha Thompson led Dorothy to a small room behind the store that served as both kitchen and living area for the couple. She heated water on a wood stove and showed Dorothy to a washroom where she could clean up in privacy. "I've got a dress might fit you," Martha said, looking Dorothy over. "Left by a woman passing through who bought new clothes. It's simple but clean." "That's very kind of you," Dorothy said gratefully. "I can pay once I reach Marfa and sell our cattle." Martha waved away her offer. "No need. Any friend of Luke Yancy's is welcome to what help we can give. That man saved my Henry's life 2 winters ago when he got caught in a blizzard out checking trap lines." Dorothy absorbed this new information about her rescuer. "He seems to make a habit of saving people." Martha smiled knowingly. "Luke's a good man, one of the best. Doesn't talk much about himself, but there's not a more reliable soul in all of Texas." Left alone with the warm water and soap, Dorothy scrubbed away the grime of the desert. The simple act of washing restored not just her cleanliness but some of her dignity as well. The dress Martha provided was a practical calico in a muted blue that fit well enough, if a bit loose around the waist. Dorothy's own boots were still serviceable after a good cleaning. When she emerged from the washroom, feeling human again, she found Luke and the Thompsons seated at a small table, enjoying coffee and what smelled like fresh baked bread. Luke stood as she entered, his eyes widening slightly before his expression returned to its usual calm. "You look better," he said simply, but something in his tone made Dorothy feel as if he'd paid her the highest compliment. "Amazing what soap and clean clothes can do," she replied with a smile, taking the seat Martha indicated. Over a simple but delicious meal of bread, cold ham, and pickles, they discussed their route to intercept the cattle drive. Henry Thompson provided valuable information about the trail conditions ahead. "Jenkins always takes the long way around Mesa Canyon," Thompson said, spreading butter on his bread. "Says it's safer for the herd." "It is," Luke agreed, But for two riders, cutting through the canyon would save nearly a day's travel. "It's rough going," Thompson warned. "And there's been talk of a mountain lion making its home up there." "We'll be cautious," Luke assured him. By early afternoon, they were ready to depart. Thompson had packed them enough supplies for several days: jerky, hardtack, coffee, and even some dried apples. Luke had purchased ammunition for his rifle and a small revolver, which he unexpectedly presented to Dorothy. "Ever used one of these?" he asked as they stood beside his freshly watered and fed horse. Dorothy examined the revolver. It was smaller than her father's gun, but appeared well maintained. "Pa taught me to shoot when I was 12, she said. Said a woman on a ranch needed to protect herself." "Good," Luke said with approval. "I hope you won't need it, but better to have it just in case." Dorothy secured the gun in the pocket of her dress, touched by his concern for her safety. Martha had also provided a hat to shield her from the sun, not as sturdy as Dorothy's own lost one, but adequate protection. They bid farewell to the Thompsons, promising to stop again on their return journey. As they rode away from the small outpost, Dorothy felt renewed hope. Clean, fed, and properly equipped, the task of catching up to the cattle drive seemed far more achievable than it had the previous day. "Thank you," she said to Luke as they settled into a steady pace. "For the gun, the supplies, for everything." Luke glanced back at her, his expression softening. "You're welcome, Dorothy." The way he said her name with a kind of quiet reverence stirred something inside her. Out here in the wilderness, with just the two of them against the vastness of the West Texas desert, Dorothy felt a connection forming that went beyond mere gratitude. She found herself noticing details about Luke she hadn't before: the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his brown hair, the quiet strength in his hands as they held the reins, the occasional soft words he spoke to his horse when the terrain grew challenging. They rode until sunset, making good time across the increasingly rugged landscape. The terrain was changing as they approached Mesa Canyon, becoming more dramatic with rock formations rising from the desert floor like ancient sentinels. Luke found them a sheltered spot to make camp, a natural hollow in the lee of a large rock formation that would protect them from the wind. They worked together to set up camp, the routine already becoming familiar. Dorothy gathered brush for the fire while Luke tended to his horse. They prepared a simple meal, more substantial than the previous nights thanks to their resupply at Thompson's Station. As they sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight, Dorothy found herself studying Luke's profile. In the flickering firelight, the planes of his face seemed both harder and softer, the strong jaw and straight nose highlighted, but his eyes reflecting a warmth that few probably ever noticed. "Why haven't you settled down?" Dorothy asked suddenly, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "Bought that land you've been saving for." Luke looked up, equally surprised. He took a moment before answering. "Never found the right place, I suppose, or the right reason to stop moving." "What would be the right reason?" Dorothy pressed gently. Luke's eyes met hers across the fire, and something passed between them, something unspoken but powerful. "Something worth staying for," he said finally, his voice low. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Luke cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early, and the canyon crossing will be challenging." Dorothy nodded, a strange mixture of disappointment and anticipation swirling inside her. Something had shifted between them, though she couldn't quite define what it was. As she settled into the bedroll Luke had again insisted she take, Dorothy found herself wondering what it would be like to have someone like Luke Yancy in her life permanently, someone solid and dependable. Someone who did the right thing not because it was easy, but because it was right. The thought followed her into sleep, coloring her dreams with possibilities she'd never before considered. Dawn broke clear and cool over the desert. Dorothy woke to find Luke already up, coffee brewing over a small fire. This time, she noticed, he looked slightly more rested, suggesting he'd actually allowed himself some sleep during the night. Mesa Canyon is about 3 hours' ride from here, he told her as they shared breakfast. The passage is narrow in places, so we'll need to go single file. Stay close. Dorothy nodded, taking his warning seriously. They packed up camp efficiently and were mounted before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The morning ride was pleasant, the air still cool enough to be comfortable. They traveled mostly in silence, both aware of the need to make good time, but it was a companionable silence rather than an awkward one. As they approached the canyon, the landscape became increasingly dramatic. Towering rock walls rose on either side of the trail, their red-orange surfaces catching the sunlight in ways that made them appear to be on fire. The path narrowed, forcing them to ride single file as Luke had warned. He took the lead, Dorothy following closely on a sturdy bay mare they'd purchased from Thompson's stable. The canyon floor was strewn with rocks and occasional patches of scrubby vegetation. Dorothy could see why cattle drivers avoided this route. It would be nearly impossible to move a large herd through the narrow, obstacle-filled passage. For 2 riders, however, it was manageable, if challenging. They were about halfway through the canyon when Luke suddenly raised his hand, signaling Dorothy to stop. She pulled her mare to a halt, instantly alert. "What is it?" she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the revolver in her pocket. Luke nodded toward a rocky ledge about 20 feet above the canyon floor. "Mountain lion. Don't make any sudden moves." Dorothy followed his gaze and saw a tawny form stretched along the rock, its tail twitching lazily as it watched them with predatory interest. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she remained still, following Luke's lead. "We'll back up slowly," Luke said quietly. "There's a wider section about 50 yards behind us. We can make a stand there if necessary." They began to retreat slowly, keeping their eyes on the mountain lion. The big cat rose to its feet, muscles rippling beneath its hide. It seemed to be assessing them, calculating. They had almost reached the wider section when the mountain lion made its decision. With a powerful leap, it sprang from its perch, aiming directly for Luke and his horse. "Hiya!" Luke shouted, spurring his mount forward suddenly. The horse bolted just as the mountain lion landed where they had been seconds before. Dorothy's mare reared in panic. She clung desperately to the saddle horn, managing to stay mounted but losing her grip on the reins. The mare bolted, galloping back the way they had come. "Dorothy!" Luke's shout echoed off the canyon walls. Dorothy fought to regain control of her panicked horse. Behind her, she heard the crack of a rifle shot, Luke firing at the mountain lion. The mare continued its headlong flight through the canyon, weaving dangerously close to the rocky walls. Finally, in a slightly wider section, Dorothy managed to grab the trailing reins and gradually slow the frightened animal. She pulled the mare to a halt, her heart pounding as loudly as the horse's hooves had been moments before. She turned in the saddle, scanning the canyon behind her. There was no sign of Luke or the mountain lion. Panic rose in her throat. "Luke," she called, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. No answer came. Dorothy hesitated, torn between waiting where she was and going back to look for him. The thought that he might be injured or worse because he had placed himself between her and danger was unbearable. Decision made, she turned the mare around and began cautiously making her way back toward the site of the attack. She drew the revolver from her pocket, holding it ready. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Raising the gun, she prepared for whatever might appear around the bend in the canyon. Luke emerged, his hat missing and a long scratch visible on his arm, but otherwise intact. Relief flooded through Dorothy with such force that she nearly dropped the revolver. "Are you all right?" They both asked simultaneously as Luke pulled his horse alongside hers. Despite the tension of the moment, Dorothy felt a bubble of laughter rise in her chest at their synchronized concern. "I'm fine," she assured him. "The mare was spooked, but I managed to stay on. You're bleeding." Luke glanced at his arm as if noticing the injury for the first time. "It's nothing. Caught my sleeve on a rock while dodging the cat." He examined her face carefully. "You sure you're not hurt?" "Positive," Dorothy said. "What happened to the mountain lion?" "Winged it with my first shot," Luke explained. "That was enough to convince it we weren't worth the trouble. It took off up into the rocks." Dorothy realized she was still pointing the revolver and hastily lowered it. "I was coming back for you," she said, suddenly self-conscious. Luke's expression softened. "That was brave. Foolish, but brave." "I couldn't just leave you," Dorothy said simply. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed so quickly and unexpectedly. "We should keep moving," Luke said after a moment. "That cat might decide we're worth another try if we linger." They continued through the canyon, more cautious now but making steady progress. By early afternoon, they emerged from the other side into a broader valley dotted with mesquite and ocotillo. The sky stretched endlessly above them, a vast blue canopy unmarred by clouds. "We've made good time," Luke said, surveying the landscape. "If we push on until dusk, we'll be within a day's ride of where the herd should be." Dorothy nodded, determined to maintain their pace despite her growing exhaustion. Every hour brought them closer to the cattle drive, and her chance to reclaim her future. They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they found themselves on a rise overlooking a shallow river, a welcome sight after the dry terrain they traversed. "We'll camp here," Luke decided. "The horses need water, and there's good grazing along the banks." They made camp efficiently, falling into roles that now felt familiar. As darkness settled around them and their small fire crackled cheerfully, Dorothy found herself studying Luke as he cleaned and checked his rifle. The day's events had revealed a new dimension to him, not just a kind man who had rescued her from the desert, but a capable protector who had put himself in danger without hesitation to ensure her safety. "Let me see your arm," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "That scratch should be cleaned properly." Luke looked up, seeming about to protest, then simply nodded and set aside his rifle. He rolled up his torn sleeve, revealing a long but shallow scratch that ran from his elbow halfway to his wrist. Dorothy retrieved the canteen and a clean cloth from her saddlebag. Kneeling beside him, she gently cleaned the wound, aware of his eyes on her as she worked. "You handled yourself well today," Luke said quietly. "Many would have panicked completely when that mountain lion appeared." Dorothy smiled slightly, not looking up from her task. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but panic doesn't solve problems. My father taught me that." "Your father was a wise man." Luke winced slightly as she dabbed at a particularly sensitive spot. "Sorry about your horse, by the way." Dorothy paused, looking up at him in confusion. "My horse?" "The one you lost when you were separated from the drive," Luke clarified. "I doubt we'll find it now. The mare from Thompson's is yours to keep." "Oh," Dorothy hadn't considered that. "That's generous of you." Luke shrugged, the movement causing her to lose her grip on his arm momentarily. "Consider it payment for your father's kindness to me years ago." Dorothy finished cleaning the scratch and sat back on her heels. You keep doing that, attributing your good deeds to obligations to my father. Can't they just be your own kindness? Luke looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with her direct gaze. Your father was one of the few men who treated me like I mattered when I was just a young drifter with nothing to my name. That counts for something. Of course it does, Dorothy agreed. But so does who you are now. The man who came back for a stranger in the desert. The man who placed himself between me and a mountain lion without hesitation. She paused, gathering her courage. I'd like to know that man better. Luke's eyes returned to hers, something vulnerable and hopeful in their depths. That man isn't anyone special, Dorothy, just someone trying to do right by people when he can. I think he's more special than he knows, Dorothy said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then Luke cleared his throat and stood, breaking the tension. We should get some rest, he said, his voice rough. Tomorrow will be another long day. Dorothy nodded, accepting his retreat for now. As they settled into their separate sleeping places on opposite sides of the fire, she found herself wondering what life might be like with someone like Luke, someone steady and reliable. Someone who did the right thing not because it was easy, but because it was who he was. The thought followed her into sleep, bringing dreams of possibilities she'd never before considered. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with just enough chill in the air to make the fire's warmth welcome. They broke camp early, both aware that this day could bring them to the cattle drive if they made good time. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed from the stark beauty of the canyon country to more open grasslands. In the distance, the silhouette of low mountains marked the horizon, the direction where Marfa lay, and with it, Dorothy's hopes for saving her ranch. Around midday, Luke pulled his horse to a halt atop a rise, scanning the terrain ahead with narrowed eyes. Dorothy rode up beside him, following his gaze. "What is it?" she asked. "Do you see something?" Luke nodded slowly. Dust cloud there to the northwest, moving slow but steady. He looked at her, a smile touching his lips. "That's a cattle drive." Dorothy's heart leaped. "Jenkins." "Can't be sure from this distance, but the timing's right. They'd be about here by now if they kept to schedule." Hope surged through Dorothy. After everything, the abandonment, the desperate thirst, the mountain lion, they had finally caught up with the drive. Her cattle, her future, were within reach. "How long?" she asked, barely able to contain her eagerness. "Few hours if we push hard," Luke estimated. "We'll need to be careful, though. Jenkins won't be expecting us, and drovers can be trigger-happy if they think rustlers are approaching their herd." They set off again, riding at a faster pace now that their goal was in sight. As they drew closer, the dust cloud resolved into the unmistakable signs of a large herd on the move, hundreds of cattle plodding across the landscape, accompanied by mounted drovers. When they were within a mile, Luke called a halt. "We'll approach openly, hands where they can be seen," he instructed. "No sudden movements. I'll do the talking until we're sure of our welcome." Dorothy nodded, suddenly nervous. How would Jenkins react to her reappearance? Would the other drovers support him if he tried to deny her rights to the cattle? They rode forward at a walk, side by side now. As they drew closer, Dorothy could see figures detaching from the main group and riding out to meet them, 3 men, rifles ready but not yet raised. "That's Jenkins in the middle," Dorothy murmured, recognizing the trail boss's distinctive broad-shouldered silhouette. Luke nodded almost imperceptibly. "Let me handle this," he reminded her. The two groups met in the open grassland, 100 yards from the main herd. Jenkins and his men pulled their horses to a halt, studying the newcomers with suspicious eyes. "That's far enough," Jenkins called, his hand resting meaningfully on his rifle. Luke raised his hands slightly to show they were empty. "No trouble here, Jenkins." "Just returning Miss Mills to her cattle drive." Jenkins's eyes widened as he recognized Dorothy. His expression cycled rapidly through surprise, confusion, and finally wariness. "Mills, thought you were dead." Dorothy lifted her chin. "Sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Jenkins." The trail boss's eyes narrowed. "Don't know what you're talking about. You got separated during that storm. We searched, but couldn't find any trace. Had to move the herd before they scattered completely." "You searched for all of an hour," Dorothy countered, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice despite Luke's warning to let him handle the conversation. "Then left me to die in the desert." Jenkins flushed angrily. "Now see here. What matters," Luke interrupted smoothly, "is that Miss Mills is here now and these are her cattle. She intends to be present when they're sold in Marfa, as is her right." One of the other drovers, a young man named Riley, whom Dorothy had always gotten along with, looked uncomfortable. "Boss, we did move on awful quick after that storm," he said quietly. Jenkins shot him a venomous look. "We had 500 head to control after that lightning spooked them. I made the call any trail boss would make." "Well, it's all water under the bridge now," Luke said diplomatically. "Miss Mills is back and will be riding with the drive to Marfa." Jenkins looked like he wanted to argue but seemed to realize he had little ground to stand on. "Fine," he said grudgingly, "but I'm still trail boss. You follow my orders like everyone else." "Of course," Luke agreed easily. "We're just here to see the cattle safely to market." With visible reluctance, Jenkins wheeled his horse around. "Come on then, we're burning daylight." As they rode toward the main herd, Riley fell in beside Dorothy. "Glad you're all right, Miss Mills," he said sincerely. "Most of us wanted to search longer, but Jenkins said there was no point, that no one could survive out there alone." "I wasn't alone for long," Dorothy said, glancing at Luke with a warm smile. "Mr. Yancy found me." Riley looked at Luke with new respect. "You tracked her through that desert after the rain washed away all sign." Luke shrugged modestly. "Got lucky, saw where the tracks diverged." They reached the herd, and Dorothy felt a surge of emotion as she recognized the familiar brands on the cattle's hides, her father's brand, now hers. These animals represented her heritage, her future, everything she'd fought so hard to preserve. "Your horse is with the remuda," Riley told her, pointing to where the spare mounts were kept together at the edge of the herd. "Still has your saddlebags on it. Jenkins said we'd divide up your things when we reached Marfa, since you wouldn't be needing them." He had the grace to look ashamed at this. Dorothy exchanged a look with Luke, who raised an eyebrow slightly as if to say, "See what kind of man he is." The remainder of the afternoon was spent reintegrating with the drive. Dorothy reclaimed her horse and saddlebags, relieved to find her father's paperwork still intact. Most of the drovers welcomed her back with genuine pleasure, though a few Jenkins's closest allies regarded her with suspicion and resentment. Luke was accepted more readily, his reputation as a capable cowhand preceding him. By the time they made camp that evening, he was already helping organize the night watch rotation, his quiet competence earning respect even from those initially wary of him. Dorothy found herself watching him throughout the evening, the ease with which he interacted with the other men, the subtle way he deflected attention from her whenever Jenkins seemed likely to make an issue of her presence. He was careful never to undermine the trail boss's authority directly, but he skillfully prevented any situations that might have forced a confrontation. After the evening meal, as the men settled around campfires in small groups, Luke joined Dorothy where she sat slightly apart from the others. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, settling beside her. "Better than I expected," Dorothy admitted. "Most of the men seem glad I'm back, or at least not upset about it." Luke nodded. Cowboys tend to respect grit, and surviving the desert alone takes plenty of that. Plus, most of them know these are your cattle. They respect that too. I wasn't alone, Dorothy reminded him. You found me. A small smile touched Luke's lips, after you'd already survived the worst of it on your own. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the campmen's voices, the occasional lowing of cattle, the crackle of fires. "We'll reach Marfa in 2 days," Luke said eventually. "What will you do after the cattle are sold?" Dorothy had been thinking about this question herself. Head back to the ranch, pay off the bank, then start rebuilding the herd. She glanced at him. "What about you? Will you keep drifting?" Luke stared into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Been thinking about that. Maybe it's time to put down some roots." Hope fluttered in Dorothy's chest. "Any particular place in mind?" Luke's eyes met hers, warm in the firelight. "Might be. Depends on a few things." Before Dorothy could ask what things those might be, Jenkins approached their fire, his expression sour. "Yancy, you've got second watch tonight. Mills, we need to talk about the sale arrangements in Marfa." Luke nodded and stood, casting Dorothy a reassuring glance before moving away to prepare for his watch duty. Dorothy steeled herself for what would likely be an unpleasant conversation with Jenkins. The trail boss lowered himself to a seat across the fire from her. "Those cattle will fetch a good price in Marfa," he began without preamble. "Beef demand is high right now." "That's good to hear," Dorothy replied cautiously. "Thing is, a drive like this takes a heavy toll on the men. Dangerous work, long hours." Jenkins fixed her with a calculating stare. "The boys deserve a bonus for their troubles." Dorothy understood immediately what he was after. "The drovers will receive the wages agreed upon before we left San Antonio, Mr. Jenkins. Plus the usual bonus if the sale price exceeds expectations, as stated in the contracts." Jenkins's face darkened. "Now see here, Mills. Things change on the trail. Circumstances arise. Extra compensation is customary." "There's nothing customary about abandoning the owner of the herd in the desert," Dorothy replied evenly. "In fact, some might consider that grounds for receiving no payment at all." Jenkins leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You be careful making accusations like that. Your word against mine, and these men have ridden with me for years. Who do you think they'll back?" "Is that a fact, Jenkins?" Luke's voice came from behind the trail boss, causing him to start in surprise. He stood just beyond the circle of firelight, his expression neutral but his eyes hard. "Because I've been hearing different around the campfires tonight. Seems quite a few of your boys weren't happy about leaving Miss Mills behind." Jenkins glared at him. "This isn't your business, Yancy." "Just passing by on my way to watch," Luke said mildly. "Couldn't help overhearing." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Miss Mills has the drive papers, Jenkins, signed and legal. Push this, and you might find yourself explaining to a judge in Marfa why you abandoned the owner of the herd in the desert and then tried to extort money from her." The trail boss's face flushed with anger, but Dorothy could see the calculation in his eyes. Luke had spoken the truth. With her documentation and the support of even a few of the drovers, she could make serious trouble for Jenkins. "The usual terms are fine," Jenkins muttered, backing down. "Just looking out for my men." "I'm sure you are," Dorothy said, keeping her voice neutral despite her desire to call him out for the liar he was. "The good ones will receive fair treatment, I assure you." Jenkins stood abruptly. "I'll hold you to that." With a final glare at Luke, he stalked away toward another fire. Luke watched him go, then turned back to Dorothy. "Sorry for interrupting. Thought you might want some support." "Your timing was perfect," Dorothy assured him. She patted the ground beside her, inviting him to sit again. "Seems I'm constantly thanking you for coming to my rescue." Luke settled beside her closer than before. You handled him well, didn't need much rescuing. Still, I appreciate knowing you're there. Dorothy felt a warm glow that had nothing to do with the fire before them. It makes me feel safe. Luke's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. I should get ready for watch, he said reluctantly, of course. Dorothy found herself disappointed that their conversation was being cut short. Be careful out there. A small smile touched Luke's lips. Always am. As he walked away toward the remuda to saddle his horse for night watch, Dorothy found herself watching him go, aware of a growing certainty in her heart. When this cattle drive ended, she didn't want Luke Yancy to drift away as he had from so many other places. The question was, did he feel the same? The next 2 days passed in the steady rhythm of the trail drive. Dorothy reclaimed her place among the drovers, working alongside them to keep the herd moving toward Marfa. Though Jenkins maintained a cold distance, most of the men treated her with a mixture of respect and protective concern that might have annoyed her under different circumstances. After her ordeal in the desert, however, she found their consideration touching rather than patronizing. Luke integrated seamlessly into the drive, his skill with cattle evident in everything he did. The other drovers quickly recognized his experience and deferred to him naturally, seeking his advice on river crossings and the handling of difficult animals. Even Jenkins grudgingly acknowledged his competence, though the trail boss clearly resented Luke's growing influence with the men. Dorothy often found her eyes drawn to Luke as they rode the confident way he sat his horse, the gentle but firm manner in which he handled the cattle, the quiet authority with which he gave suggestions rather than orders. She noticed, too, the way he always seemed aware of where she was, positioning himself to keep her in sight whenever possible. On the evening of the second day, Jenkins announced that they would reach Marfa by noon the following day. The news sent a ripple of excitement through the camp. For the drovers, it meant the end of weeks of hard work and the beginning of a brief period of relaxation and spending before the journey home. For Dorothy, it meant the culmination of everything she'd fought for, the chance to sell her cattle for a price that would save her ranch. After the evening meal, Dorothy found a quiet spot away from the main fires, needing a moment alone to gather her thoughts. So much had happened since she joined this cattle drive, losing her way, nearly dying in the desert, being rescued by Luke, the growing feelings between them that neither had yet put into words. Mind some company. Luke's voice broke into her thoughts. Dorothy looked up with a smile. Not at all. He settled beside her, his shoulder close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. We'll reach Marfa tomorrow, Luke said finally. Yes, Dorothy replied. It feels strange, knowing the journey's almost over. Luke nodded, his expression thoughtful. What happens after the sale? Dorothy turned to look at him directly. I'll pay the drovers, settle accounts with the bank representative who'll be waiting in Marfa, then head back to the ranch. She paused, gathering her courage. What about you? Will you keep drifting? Luke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant horizon. Been thinking about that a lot these past few days. He turned to face her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. Feels like maybe I've been drifting long enough. Dorothy's heart quickened. Does that mean you're considering settling somewhere? Somewhere, Luke agreed, a slight smile touching his lips. If I had the right reason. What would be the right reason? Dorothy asked softly, echoing their conversation from days earlier. Luke's eyes held hers steadily. Someone worth staying for. The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility. Dorothy was acutely aware of every detail of this moment: the gentle night breeze, the distant sounds of the cattle, the way the firelight cast shadows across Luke's features, softening them. "Luke," she began, not entirely sure what she was going to say, but knowing she needed to say something. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "These past few days have been the most important of my life, Dorothy. Finding you in that desert, it changed something in me." Dorothy squeezed his hand, encouragement and agreement in the gesture. "It changed me too. I've spent years drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots," Luke continued. "Always told myself I was saving for my own spread someday, but the truth is, I was afraid to stop moving, afraid to risk caring too much about any one place or—" He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Any one person." "And now," Dorothy prompted gently when he fell silent. "Now I'm more afraid of moving on," Luke admitted. "Of losing this chance, of losing you." Dorothy's free hand rose to touch his cheek. "Then don't move on. Stay." "Dorothy Mills," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you asking me to come back to the Double M with you?" "I'm asking you to consider making it your home," Dorothy clarified. "Not as a hired hand, but as my partner in every way." Luke's eyes widened slightly. "That's a serious offer. Your father's ranch means everything to you." "Yes, it does," Dorothy agreed. "But these past days have shown me that some things matter even more. I nearly died in that desert, Luke. You saved more than my life when you came back for me. You saved my future. And I've come to realize I want that future to include you." For a moment, Luke seemed too overwhelmed to speak. Then, slowly, he leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "I want that too," he whispered. "More than I've ever wanted anything." Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss that quickly deepened as years of loneliness and weeks of growing feelings converged in this one perfect moment. Dorothy's arms wound around Luke's neck as his encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Luke's smile held a joy Dorothy had never seen there before. "Guess I should be thankful Jenkins left you behind," he said, a teasing light in his eyes. "Otherwise we might never have met," Dorothy laughed softly. "Don't tell him that. He's insufferable enough already." Luke's expression grew more serious. "There'll be talk, you know. A single woman inviting a man to her ranch. People will gossip." "Let them," Dorothy said firmly. "Though we could silence the gossips easily enough if we wanted to." Luke raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" "Well," Dorothy said, suddenly feeling shy despite her boldness moments before, "if we were married, no one could object to us running the ranch together." Luke's eyes widened, then crinkled with amusement and tenderness. "Dorothy Mills, are you proposing to me?" Dorothy felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I suppose I am. Is that terribly forward of me?" "Terribly," Luke agreed, his smile widening. "And absolutely perfect." He took both her hands in his. "But if we're going to do this, let me do it properly." To Dorothy's surprise, Luke shifted to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. The gesture was all the more meaningful for the simplicity of their surroundings, no fancy restaurant or parlor, just the vast Texas sky above, and the promise of a shared future between them. "Dorothy Mills," Luke said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You've shown me what it means to have something worth fighting for, worth staying for. I've been drifting all my life, but I've finally found my home. It's wherever you are. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to Dorothy's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Luke Yancy, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the days to come. When they parted, both were smiling so widely it almost hurt. "When we reach Marfa," Luke said, "we'll find a preacher. No sense waiting if we're both sure." "Are you sure?" Dorothy asked, suddenly needing confirmation. "This is happening so fast." Luke's expression grew thoughtful. "Some things you just know, Dorothy. I've worked for dozens of ranchers, met hundreds of women in towns across the West. Never felt for any of them what I felt the moment I saw you under that mesquite tree, refusing to give up even when hope seemed lost." His hand gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm surer about this than I've ever been about anything in my life." His certainty calmed any remaining doubts in Dorothy's heart. "Then yes, we'll find a preacher in Marfa." She smiled mischievously. "Jenkins will be beside himself when he realizes he'll have to pay your share of the cattle sale to me as your wife." Luke laughed, the sound rich and warm in the night air. "That's just an added bonus." They remained together under the stars for a long while, talking of their plans for the future improvements to the ranch, breeding strategies for the herd, the possibility of children someday. When they finally returned to the main camp, several of the drovers noticed the change between them, exchanging knowing glances but making no comment. As Dorothy settled into her bedroll that night, her heart was fuller than it had ever been. The cattle drive that had nearly killed her had instead given her a new life and a love she hadn't even known she was looking for. Tomorrow they would reach Marfa, sell the cattle, and begin their future together. The thought filled her with a joy so complete it seemed almost overwhelming. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the final push to Marfa. The entire camp was up early, an air of excitement permeating everything as the drovers prepared for the last leg of their journey. Dorothy and Luke shared a private smile over the morning coffee, their secret plans adding to the anticipation of the day ahead. By mid-morning, the distinctive buildings of Marfa appeared on the horizon. The small but growing town served as an important cattle shipping point, with a railroad spur that connected to larger lines heading east. As they approached, Dorothy could see activity in the cattle pens at the edge of town, buyers preparing to assess the incoming herds. Jenkins rode up beside Dorothy, his expression still sour but tempered with a grudging respect. "Looks like we've got good timing. 3 buyers in town from what the scout says. Should mean competitive prices." Dorothy nodded. "Good. The men deserve their bonuses for a successful drive." Jenkins studied her face for a moment, then glanced at Luke riding nearby. "Heard talk around the campfire last night. You two making plans?" "Mr. Yancy and I have come to an understanding," Dorothy confirmed, seeing no reason to hide what would soon be public knowledge anyway. "He'll be returning to the Double M with me after the sale." Jenkins snorted. "Figured as much. Could have done worse, I suppose. Yancy knows his business, I'll give him that." Coming from Jenkins, this was high praise indeed. Dorothy accepted it with a gracious nod, refusing to let the trail boss's grudging attitude dampen her happiness. They reached the holding pens by noon, exactly as Jenkins had predicted. The cattle were counted and inspected by representatives of the various buyers, all of whom seemed impressed with the condition of the animals despite the long drive. Dorothy, with her father's paperwork in hand, was readily accepted as the owner, though she noted several surprised glances at her gender. Luke stayed close to her throughout the negotiations, offering quiet advice when asked, but never overstepping. His presence gave her confidence, and Dorothy found herself driving a harder bargain than she might have alone. By late afternoon, a deal had been struck that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. With the sale complete and payment secured, Dorothy fulfilled her obligations to the drovers, paying them their agreed wages plus the generous bonuses she had promised. Even Jenkins received his due, though he accepted it with poor grace. "Never thought I'd see the day when Jack Mills's little girl would be paying my wages," he muttered as he counted his money. "My father taught me well, Mr. Jenkins," Dorothy replied evenly. "About cattle, about business, and about the value of good people." She paused meaningfully. "And how to recognize those who aren't so good." Jenkins had the grace to look uncomfortable at this. He tucked the money away and touched the brim of his hat in a reluctant gesture of respect. "Good luck with your ranch, Miss Mills. You'll need it, Mrs. Yancy, soon enough," Dorothy corrected him with a smile. "And thank you, but I don't believe in luck, just hard work and good partners." Jenkins's eyebrows rose at this news, but he offered no further comment, merely nodding and walking away toward the saloon where most of the other drovers were already celebrating the end of the drive. With their business concluded, Dorothy and Luke were free to attend to their personal plans. They made their way to Marfa's small church, where they found the preacher tending to his garden. Reverend Thomas Harding was a kindly man in his 60s who listened to their story with evident delight. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said when they had finished explaining their whirlwind courtship. "Bringing you together through such hardship only to find such joy. I'd be honored to marry you today, if possible," Luke added, giving Dorothy's hand a gentle squeeze. "We're eager to begin our life together," the Reverend smiled. "I see no reason to wait, though we should have witnesses. My wife can serve as one, but we'll need another." "I might know someone," Dorothy suggested. "One of the drovers, Riley, was kind to me throughout the drive. I trust him." They found Riley at the general store rather than the saloon, purchasing supplies for his journey home. He seemed surprised but genuinely pleased when they explained their request. "Be honored, Miss Mills," he said, his young face breaking into a grin. "Always thought you deserved better than Jenkins's treatment. Glad to see you found someone worthy." With their witnesses arranged, Dorothy and Luke returned to the church at the appointed time. Though circumstances allowed for nothing elaborate, Dorothy had managed to purchase a new dress from the general store, a simple blue calico that complimented her eyes. Luke, too, had spruced up, wearing a clean white shirt he'd bought for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows before the Reverend, Dorothy felt a sense of rightness and completion that transcended the simplicity of their surroundings. When Luke placed a simple gold band on her finger hastily purchased from the town's jeweler that afternoon, and the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, joy bubbled up inside her like a desert spring. Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. Riley and Mrs. Harding applauded enthusiastically, their genuine happiness adding to the warmth of the moment. Afterward, they enjoyed a celebratory meal at Marfa's small hotel restaurant, the closest thing to a wedding feast the frontier town could provide. Riley joined them, and his youthful exuberance and sincere good wishes made the occasion feel festive despite its modest nature. That night, as husband and wife, they shared a room at the hotel, their first true privacy since meeting in the desert. As Luke closed the door behind them, Dorothy felt a moment of shyness despite the intimacy they had already shared in their hearts. Luke sensed her nervousness and approached her slowly, taking her hands in his. "We have all the time in the world now," he said softly. "There's no rush for anything." Dorothy's hesitation melted away at his consideration. "I'm not nervous about us," she assured him, stepping closer. "Just overwhelmed by how much has changed in so short a time. A week ago I was facing losing everything. Now I feel like I've gained the world." Luke's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "I'm the one who's gained everything," he murmured. "A home, a purpose, and the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Their kiss deepened, passion quickly replacing tenderness as days of growing desire finally found expression. Dorothy felt herself responding to his touch with an intensity that might have shocked her before, but now seemed only natural, the culmination of their journey from strangers to life partners. That night, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their union as natural and right as everything else that had brought them together. In Luke's arms, Dorothy found a belonging she hadn't known she was missing. In Dorothy's embrace, Luke found the home he'd been searching for all his life. The following morning, they began preparations for their return journey to the Double M. With their newfound wealth from the cattle sale, they purchased supplies and equipment that would be needed at the ranch. Luke proved to have a keen eye for quality horses, selecting several promising animals to bolster the ranch's stock. 3 days later, they set out from Marfa with their pack horses and new mounts. The journey back to San Antonio would take nearly 2 weeks, but neither minded the prospect of the long ride. Every mile brought them closer to the home they would build together, and the time alone allowed them to deepen their understanding of each other. As they traveled eastward, they shared stories of their lives, filling in the details that their whirlwind courtship hadn't allowed time for. Dorothy learned about Luke's childhood in East Texas, his complicated relationship with his older brother who had inherited the family farm, his years of drifting from ranch to ranch. Luke heard about Dorothy's mother who had died when she was young, her father's patient teaching as he raised her to take over the ranch someday, her struggles to be taken seriously in a world that saw ranching as men's work. "Your father was ahead of his time," Luke observed one evening as they camped beside a small stream, "teaching you everything about the business instead of trying to marry you off." Dorothy smiled at the memory. "He always said ability mattered more than what you were born as." "He'd have liked you, Luke, not just because you saved my life, but because you see me as an equal." "That's because you are," Luke said simply, "an equal partner in everything we do from now on." The journey passed pleasantly, unmarred by the dangers that had characterized their first meeting. When they finally crested the rise that overlooked the Double M, Dorothy felt a swell of emotion at the sight of the ranch buildings nestled in the valley below. "Welcome home," she said to Luke, watching his face as he took in the view. Luke's eyes moved over the property, the sturdy main house, the barn and corral, the bunkhouse for the few hands they employed, the grazing land stretching beyond. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "Everything you described and more." They rode down to the ranch, where they were greeted enthusiastically by the small staff who had remained behind during the cattle drive. Old Miguel, who had worked for Dorothy's father for 20 years and now served as foreman, listened to their story with wide eyes and increasing delight. "Don Yancy," he said, formally addressing Luke after Dorothy had introduced him as her husband. "The Senorita Perdon. The Senora has needed someone worthy of her in this land. I am pleased she has found you." Luke accepted this blessing with appropriate gravity. "I'll do my best to be worthy of both, Miguel." The first weeks of their marriage were busy ones as they settled into the rhythm of running the ranch together. Dorothy paid off the bank loan with the proceeds from the cattle sale, securing their ownership of the Double M for the foreseeable future. Luke proved himself an invaluable partner, bringing new ideas for breeding and land management, while respecting the traditions Dorothy's father had established. Word of their sudden marriage spread quickly through the surrounding ranches and into San Antonio. Some expressed surprise, a few disapproval at the hasty nature of their union, but most who met them could see the genuine love and partnership they shared. By the spring of 1879, the Double M was flourishing under their joint leadership. The remaining cattle were thriving, with promising new calves strengthening the herd. Luke had implemented irrigation improvements that allowed them to grow more feed, reducing their vulnerability to drought. Dorothy had established connections with new markets that promised better prices for their beef. On a warm evening in April, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Dorothy leaned against Luke's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping an arm around her. "Completely," she affirmed. "Though I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Luke asked, his fingers absently playing with a strand of her hair. Dorothy turned to face him, a smile playing at her lips. "This house feels like it could use more laughter in it, maybe the kind that comes with little feet running around." Luke's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy as he understood her meaning. "Are you saying—" "Not yet," Dorothy clarified, "but I'd like to be, soon, if you're ready for that." Luke pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying his answer before he put it into words. "Nothing would make me happier than building our family on this land." As darkness settled over the ranch and the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Dorothy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The cattle drive that had left her stranded and seemingly doomed had instead led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. Luke's decision to come back for her, to offer water and shade when she needed it most, had been just the beginning of all he would give her: love, partnership, and a future brighter than she had ever imagined. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Luke's hand resting protectively over her abdomen where they both hoped new life would soon take root, Dorothy whispered, "I never thought I'd be grateful for being abandoned in the desert." Luke propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with tenderness. "Life has a way of taking our worst moments and turning them into pathways to our best ones, if we're brave enough to keep going." "You were my pathway," Dorothy said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "And I plan to keep going with you for the rest of our days." "That's a promise I intend to help you keep, Mrs. Yancy," Luke replied, sealing their covenant with a kiss. By the following spring, the sound of a baby's laughter indeed filled their home. Their son, Jack Lucas Yancy, named for both Dorothy's father and Luke's, arrived on a stormy March night in 1880, bringing new joy to the thriving ranch. Over the years that followed, the Double M grew to become one of the most respected ranches in the region. Luke and Dorothy added to their family a daughter, Emma, joined them 2 years after Jack, followed by another son, William, 3 years later. They never forgot how their story began with abandonment, desperate thirst, and the kindness of a stranger who refused to ride past someone in need. They taught their children those same values of compassion and integrity, building a legacy that went beyond cattle and land to touch the hearts and lives of all who knew them. The West would change dramatically during their lifetime, with railroads, new settlements, and eventually automobiles transforming the landscape they had crossed on horseback. But through all those changes, the love that had begun in the harshest circumstances continued to flourish, proving that even in the most unforgiving environments, the human heart could find not just survival, but boundless joy.